Does English have digraph gn that does not come from Norman, Old French? I noticed that in English the digraph gn appears in a strange way. Some examples I can find are the word stems, cogn dash, sign dash, line dash, all of which looks very similar to French counterparts. By this I think gn is of French origin, and should be borrowed into English as a result of the Norman conquest. OTOH, in many words, gn is either pronounced separately or is at the beginning, which contradicts with the French origin hypothesis, because in French gn is pronounced like ny, e.g. canyon. And also note that this pronunciation is similar to other Germanic languages like German, but I can't find any similarity between a German word containing gn and an English gn word. Words imported from Latin or Greek families via Old French after the Norman conquest, 1066 AD, might as well not be considered native English, while I think Romance-originated words borrowed into Old English before that are probably fair game, but there probably aren't any with gn.
At the start of words like gnaw. Yes, at the start of some words like gnaw. Even though the G in gnaw is silent in present-day English, it used to represent a consonant sound. So originally, the gn in this word wouldn't have been a digraph so much as a consonant cluster, albeit a special kind of consonant cluster. The sounds are tautosyllabic or in the same syllable. As the spelling suggests, the consonant cluster is thought to have originally been pronounced as gn, although it may have developed other realizations in certain time periods. The distinction in pronunciation between words starting with gn and words starting with n seems to have been lost sometime in the early modern English time period. An Introduction to Early Modern English, by Turdu Nevalainen, 2006, says the change of gn to n was completed in the South in the 18th century, page 128. In the middle of some compound words like hangnail. There are also some compound words made from native elements that are spelled with gn dash, such as hangnail. G itself isn't very frequent in non-word initial position in native English vocabulary because of sound changes. That G sound is a bit rare outside of word initial position in native English vocabulary because it was historically vocalized in many contexts to J or W. The vocalization of G to J, in palatalizing contexts, had already occurred by the time of Old English, at least, in West Saxon dialects, so the letter G, in Old English spellings could represent the palatal glide J. We have evidence for this from spellings that use G unetymologically to represent J. That did not originate from the Proto-Germanic * G sound, e.g. the word for year, cognate to German Jahr, was spelled with the letter G in Old English. The Old English word reg that Laurel's answer mentions was probably pronounced something like regen. The vocalization of G to W, which occurred later, seems to have developed via rounding of earlier. An example is the modern English word owner, which the OED says had spellings like Agnia, Agnia, and Arnia in Old English. The Bosworth-Toller entry is at Agnia. The pronunciation of gn dash as gn is not inconsistent with Latin, or even French origins for a word. The pronunciation of gn as gn in many Latinate words is based on spelling, and also partly on certain traditions for pronouncing Latin, which may have themselves have been based on spelling. It doesn't have much if anything to do with Germanic. Note that even though gn is pronounced as most of the time in French words, there are actually some learned French words where gn is used, such as ignition and stagnation.
Other words of English etymology using a gn are gnarl, gnash, and gnat. As Semelik has pointed out, they are found at the beginning of these words.
Old English had a lot of words spelled with gn somewhere in the word. With some patience you can get a pretty complete list on Bosworth-Toller's Anglo-Saxon Dictionary online by doing a regular expression search for gn. The first 500-ish hits are valid, the rest match words found in the body of the definition. Cross-checking with the OED, I see that very few current words have an etymology of Germanic and are spelled still with a gn. Most of them I've never heard of and were added to the language from German itself much later. The two I have heard of are nat and gnaw, which both date back to Old English. One I haven't heard of is agnail, oe angnigel, which according to the OED is etymologically from the Germanic base of ang plus the Germanic base of nail, see also etymonline. I do see there are plenty of words that are still used that lost the gn. For example, again was once spelled on Jane. In addition, rain was spelled reg.
I think you are confusing spelling and pronunciation. English has tended to a certain, in some ways confusing, deviation in how different forms of the same root word is pronounced. So, In French, we have the verb prononcer and the noun pronunciation. In English, we have the verb pronounce, but the noun pronunciation. The French pronounce and spell the syllable in question, verb, and noun in exactly the corresponding way. The English do not. So with your word sign, the French pronounce the G in signer, strictly the G and N are slurred together as more like in the same way as in the verb signer and the noun signal, Latin signum, probably, it is now thought, pronounced rather like today's French. But English, in adopting the word signer, has shifted its vowel sound from the E to the pronunciation of sign, as in line. Yet in the noun signal this has not happened, the G is no longer silent, any more than it is in signify, CP. French signifier, pronounced like signer. This kind of silent G only occurs, as far as I can find, when it occurs in a final syllable, as in resign, but resignation. Another interesting example is French line, with English line, not a line. Here the corresponding Latin is not a lignum, which means wood, but linear, meaning thread, or line, with no G, silent or otherwise. I do not know why it is not spelled line, pronounced fin, as in fine, similarly pronounced. After all, the noun linearite and adjective linéaire. Where does that leave us? First, it is an illustration of how language, including how it is pronounced and spelled, over time. A major factor in this, above all in times when literacy was not as widespread and communication was more localized than it came to be by the end of the 18th century, was natural selection and, as part of that, how words sat comfortably in the mouth. One key part of this was the so-called great vowel shift, in which letters I and E came to sit higher in the mouth. So, we might think, as E shifted, the G before N became awkward to say and fell silent. Meanwhile, spelling partly sticks with old spelling and partly reacts to the most prevalent changes. One other point is that it is difficult to speak of a native version of English, or indeed of Aboriginal English people. English is derived from the language of the Germanic tribe of Angles, who invaded, as did the Saxons and then the Vikings, each with their own Germanic dialects. Before that had come the Romans, bringing with them people from all over Western Europe, the Middle East and North Africa. Later, of course, came the French-speaking Normans, whose language filled the aristocracy and, no doubt, the legal, medical and merchant professions, as well as Latin-using clerics, while much of the peasantry remained illiterate and had the most passing knowledge of French or Latin. English as we know it emerged from the clash between the two languages. So we see that the words for the most basic things are generally Anglo-Saxon: house, window, hand, where, go, foot, boat, day, night. The French involves things peasants would not possess or need. As the two came together, the Anglo-Saxon tended to prevail for most everyday purposes, while Franco-Latin and, indeed, Greek prevailed for professional, intellectual, technical, legal and similar areas of life, of which the large mass of people had little contact. There is no discoverable native language. It happened over hundreds of years. So there is no native English in the sense you mean. The language is a mongrel.
Smart potato.